Hello students, in this video we will discuss summary of part 2 of Introduction to The Empire Writes Back. In this portion of the essay, the authors discuss four important concepts. They are hegemony, language, place, and post-coloniality and theory. Now let us look at hegemony first. This section begins by the questioning of authors. They question why should post-colonial societies continue to engage with the imperial experience. Since all the post-colonial societies we discuss have achieved political independence, why is the issue of coloniality still relevant at all? So, the post-colonial countries have become independent, but their literature, what they write, is still concerned with colonial or imperial experience. They are not coming out of the clutches of this idea or attitude. So the authors ask this question of why the empire needs to write back to a center once the imperial structure has been dismantled in political terms is an important one. So, to answer this question, they write Britain, like the other dominant colonial powers of 19th century, has been relegated to a relatively minor place in the international affairs. Now, Britain doesn't have the original power it used to have in the international arena. It is superseded by USA in the fields of politics, economics, and mass media, or in any other field. US is in the forefront. Britain and other European imperial powers have been superseded by the emergent power of the USA. Nevertheless, through the literary canon, the body of British texts, which all too frequently still acts as a touchstone of taste and value. In spite of its political and economic downfall, Britain continues to exercise its influence through the body of British texts, which still act as standard or touchstone of taste and value. And through RS English or Received Standard English, which asserts the English of Southeast England as a universal norm, and the English language they speak or the Received Standard English is considered to be the pure, original, universal form of English language. The weight of antiquity continues to dominate cultural production in much of the post-colonial world. So, anything written in the Received Standard English is considered as important and universal, whereas what comes from the post-colonial nations is relegated to the margin. This cultural hegemony has been maintained through canonical assumptions about literary activity and through attitude to post-colonial literatures which identify them as isolated national offshoots of English literature. And whatever literature is coming from post-colonial nations is always considered inferior to the canonical standards or English texts. So they are always considered marginal. And which therefore relegate them to marginal and subordinate positions. So, the canonical body of English texts have not accepted any other literature coming from the post-colonial world to be equal to theirs. They always considered it as inferior or subordinate. more recently, as the range and strength of these literatures have become undeniable, but in recent years, the quality and quantity of post colonial literature has increased, and Britain has started a new technique or tactic, and that is the process of incorporation or assimilation, in which, employing Eurocentric standards of judgment, the center has sought to claim those works and writers of which it approves as British. So, since they are winning awards, the writers of the post colonial world nations, they are winning awards, or they are getting more and more approval from the readers. Now, the British literature is considering it as its own. It is approving it as British. In all these respects, the parallels between situation of post-colonial writing and that of feminist writing is striking. Now, feminist writing was once again considered as marginal or subordinate, just like post-colonial writing is considered. So here, authors find a similarity between how post-colonial writers and feminist writing is treated. Now, coming to language, one of the main features of imperial oppression is control over language. The imperial education system installs a standard version of metropolitan language as the norm and marginalizes all variants as impurities. Now, just in the last paragraph, we saw received pronunciation, received English. So that is considered as the pure original form of English, and the variants which come from the post colonial countries is considered to be impure. As a character in Mrs. Campbell Pratt's 19th century Australian novel, Policy and Passion puts it, to be colonial is to talk Australian slang, to be everything that is abominable. Language becomes the medium through which a hierarchical structure of power is perpetuated, and the medium through which conceptions of truth, order, and reality become established. Now, language can also be a medium of hierarchical structure of power. Such power is rejected in the emergence of an effective post colonial voice. So, post colonial literature must reject the hierarchical nature of this language. For this reason, the discussion of post colonial writing, which follows, is largely a discussion of the process by which a language with its power and the writing with its significance of authority has been wrested from the dominant European culture. In order to focus on the complex ways in which the English language has been used in these societies and to indicate their own sense of difference, we distinguish in this account between standard British English inherited from the empire and the English which the language has become in post colonial countries. Authors of the book The Empire Writes Back differentiate, or they categorize English into two types. First is standard British English with E, capital E, and the literature or the language of post colonial countries with a small e in English. So he says there are two types of English here. one standard British English with a capital E, and English of the post-colonial countries with a small e. Though British imperialism resulted in the spread of a language, English across the globe, the English of Jamaicans is not the English of Canadians. So, English in the colonies, in the post colonial countries, has been mixed with their native language, and so it has the flavor of the native tongue. Therefore, we can have English of the Jamaicans, English of the Canadians, Kenyans, etc. We need to distinguish between what is proposed as standard code English, the language of the erstwhile imperial center, and the linguistic code English, which has been transformed and subverted into several distinctive varieties throughout the world. For this reason, the distinction between English and English, one with capital E, another with small e, will be used throughout our text as an indication of the various ways in which language has been employed by different linguistic communities in the post colonial world. The use of these terms asserts the fact that a continuum exists between the various linguistic practices which constitute English usage in the modern world. Although linguistically the links between English and the various post-colonial Englishes in use today are seen as unbroken, the political reality is that English sets itself apart from the other lesser variants and so demands to be integrated about its claim to the special status. In practice, the history of this distinction between English and English has been between the claims of a powerful center and a multitude intersecting usages designated as peripheries. The language of these peripheries was shaped by an oppressive discourse of power, yet they have been the site of some of the most exciting and innovative literatures of the modern period, and this has, at least in part, been the result of the energies uncovered by the political tension between the idea of a normative code and a variety of regional usages. In this big paragraph, the authors talk about two kinds of English. One, the original British English, which has a capital E, and the other English of the post colonial countries with a small e. So, the British English considers itself to be superior and pure form of literature, whereas the literature of the colonies or the English of the colonies is considered as inferior, and the superior language keeps itself isolated. It doesn't mix with the English of the colonies. And so here the authors make it clear that the language of the peripheries was shaped by an oppressive discourse of power. So it was the force or the influence of English that that necessitated the creation of other varieties of English, and there has been the post-colonial countries have been sites where most exciting innovative literature is coming out. Next, let us go to the place and displacement concept. Here, the authors are of the opinion that a major feature of post-colonial literature is the concern with place and displacement. It is here that the special post-colonial crisis of identity comes into being. the concern with the development or recovery of an effective identifying relationship between self and place. So we know that the most of the colonial subjects, they are displaced from their place of birth due to migration, slavery, and lot of other reasons. So that displacement has an impact on their identity. Indeed, critics such as D.S. Maxwell have made this defining model of post-coloniality. The idea of displacement is considered as very important. A valid and active sense of self may have been eroded by dislocation resulting from migration, the experience of enslavement, transportation, or cultural um, or voluntary indent removal for indentured labor. So these are the reasons why the colonial population has been displaced, or it may have been destroyed by cultural denigration, that is, unfairly criticizing and ill treating somebody. The conscious and unconscious oppression of the indigenous personality and culture by a supposedly superior racial cultural model. The dialectic of place and displacement is always a feature of post colonial societies, whether these have been created by a process of settlement, intervention, or a mixture of the two. Beyond their historical and cultural differences, place displacement and a pervasive concern with the myths of identity and authenticity are features common to all post colonial literatures in English. The alienation of vision and the crisis in self image, which this displacement produces, is as frequently found in the accounts of Canadian free settlers as of Australian convicts, Fijian Indian or Trinidadian Indian indentured laborers, West Indian slaves, or forcibly colonized Nigerians, Bengalis, etc. Although this is pragmatically demonstrable from a wide range of texts, it is difficult to account for by theories which this social and linguistic alienation as resulting only from overtly oppressive forms of colonization such as slavery or conquest. An adequate account of this practice must go beyond the usual categories of social alienation, such as master slave, free bonded, ruler ruled. But however important and widespread these may be in post colonial cultures. After all, why should the free settler, formerly unconstrained and theoretically free to continue in the possession and practice of Englishness, also show clear signs of alienation even within the first generation of settlement and manifest a tendency to seek an alternative, differentiated identity? The most widely shared discursive practice within which this alienation can be identified is the construction of place. The gap which opens between the experience of place and language available to describe it forms a classic and all pervasive feature of post colonial texts. This gap occurs for those whose language seems inadequate to describe a new place, for those whose language is systematically destroyed by enslavement, and for those whose language has been rendered unprivileged by the imposition of the language of a colonizing power. Such admixture of one or two or other of these models can describe situation in all post-colonial societies. In each case, a condition of alienation is inevitable until the colonizing language has been replaced or appropriated as English. That imperialism results in a profound linguistic alienation is so obviously the case in cultures in which pre-colonial culture is suppressed by military conquest or enslavement. For example, an Indian writer like Raja Rao or a Nigerian writer like Chinua Achebe have needed to transform the language to use it in a different way in its new context, and so, as Achebe says, quoting James Baldwin, make it bear the burden of their experience. Although Rao and Achebe write from their own place and so have not suffered a literal geographical displacement, they have to overcome an imposed gap resulting from linguistic displacement of the pre colonial language by English. This process occurs within a more comprehensive discourse of place and displacement in the wider post colonial context. Such alienation is shared by those whose possession of English is indisputably native, yet who begin to feel alienated with its practice once its vocabulary, categories, and codes are felt to be inadequate or inappropriate to describe the fauna, the physical and geographical condition, or the cultural practices they have developed in a new land. The absurdities used by the Canadian poet Joseph Howe is given as an example here. Such absurdities demonstrate the pressing need these native speakers share with those colonized people who were directly oppressed to escape from the inadequacies and imperial constraints of English as a social practice. So, next we will go to post coloniality and theory. The idea of post colonial literary theory emerges from the inability of European theory to deal adequately with the complexities and varied cultural provenance of post colonial writing. European theories themselves emerge from a particular cultural tradition which are hidden by false notions of the universal. Theories of style and genre, assumptions about universal features of language, epistemologies, and value system are all radically questioned by the practices of post colonial writing. Post colonial theory has proceeded from the need to address this different practice. Indigenous theories have developed to accommodate the difference within various cultural traditions as well as the desire to describe in a comparative way the features shared across those traditions. The political and cultural monocentrism of the colonial enterprise was a natural result of the philosophical traditions of the European world and the system of representation which this privileged. 19th century imperial expansion, the culmination of the outward and dominating thrust of Europeans into the world beyond Europe, which began during early Renaissance, was underpinned in complex ways by these assumptions. In the first instance, this produced practices of cultural subservience characterized by one post colonial critic as cultural cringe. Subsequently, the emergence of identifiable indigenous theories in reaction to this formed an important element in the development of specific national and regional consciousness. Paradoxically, however, imperial expansion has had radically destabilizing effect on its own preoccupations and power. In pushing the colonial world to the margin of experience, the center pushed consciousness beyond the point at which monocentrism in all spheres of thought could be accepted without question. In other words, this alienating process, which initially served to relegate the post colonial world to the margin, turned upon itself and acted to push that world through a kind of mental barrier into a position from which all experiences can be viewed as uncentered. Marginality thus became an unprecedented source of creative energy. So they conclude this essay by saying that the task of this book is twofold. First, to identify the range nature of post colonial text. Secondly, to describe the various theories which have emerged so far to account for them. So, in the first chapter, the authors will consider the development of descriptive models of post colonial writing. Since it is not possible to read post colonial texts without coming to terms with the ways in which they appropriate and deploy the material of linguistic culture, in second chapter they outline the process by which language is captured to form a distinctive discursive practice. In the third chapter, they demonstrate through a symptomatic reading of text how post colonial writing interacts with the social and material practices of colonialism. One of the major purpose of this book is to explain the nature of existing post colonial theory and the way in which it interacts with and dismantles some of the assumptions of European theory. And the fourth chapter, we will discuss the issues in development of indigenous post colonial theories. In the fifth, they will examine larger implications of post coloniality for theories of language, for literary theory, and for social and political analysis in general. So, in this second part of this essay, we have seen that how the language of post colonial literature is very much distinct from that of British literary canon, how it is necessary to evolve and generate such a language. We also saw what is the hegemonic attitude which standard British literature exerts on post colonial literature. We saw the importance of place and displacement, and also the place of post colonial theory.